The poetry of the French poet Ovid L. MILOSZ is not well known outside France, which is a great pity. His nephew, his younger cousin, was Ezra Pound, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1980. And the problem with de MILOSZ is that there is virtually none of his work translated. There are a few poems in my two favourite anthologies, one of which I still think is probably the two best all-round anthologies of modern French poetry, is the Penguin Book of French Verse, the 20th Century, introduced and edited by Anthony Hartley in the early 1960s, and about the same time the Random House Book of 20th Century French Poetry, edited by Paul Auster, about the same time. Auster went on to have considerable fame as a novelist, but I never really took to his novels. I think he was much better at editing and translating French poetry. De MILOSZ, his poetry is very romantic. It's very powerful. But unfortunately, most of it is not translated, and therefore it is limited, and one is limited in what one can do. I read one astonishingly powerful translation, and then I chanced to check on the translator and found it was Ezra Pound. So obviously Pound too liked de MILOSZ's work. This is called Symphonie de Novembre, which Pound translated not as November Symphony, because there is an unfortunately over-romantic trend in de MILOSZ's many novels, which are also strangely translated. Pound has translated as strophes. I'll read it verse by verse and translation by verse. Ce sera tout à fait comme dans cette vie. La même chambre. Oui, mon enfant, la même. Au petit jour, l'oiseau des temps dans la feuille parle comme une morte. Alors, les servantes se lèvent et l'on entend le bruit glacé et creux des seaux à la fontaine. It will be as it is in this life. The same room, yes, the same, and at daybreak the bird of time in the leafage, pale as a dead woman's face, and the servants moving, and the icy hollow noise of the fountain taps. Oh, terrible, terrible jeunesse, cœur vide, ce sera tout à fait comme dans cette vie. Il y aura les voix pauvres, les voix d'hiver, des vieux faubourgs, le vitrier avec sa chanson alternée. Terrible, terrible youth, and the heart empty. Oh, it will be as it is in this life. The poor voices, the winter voices in the worn-out suburbs, and the window mender's cracked street cry. La grand-mère cassée qui, sous le bonnet sale, crie des noms de poissons, l'homme au tablier bleu qui crache dans sa main usée par le brancard et hurle on ne sait quoi, comme l'ange du jugement. The dirty bonnet, with an old woman under it, howling a catalogue of stale fish, and the blue-aproned fellow spitting on his chapped hands and bellowing like an angel of judgment. Ce sera tout à fait comme dans cette vie. La même table, la Bible, Goethe, l'encre et son odeur de temps, de papier. Femme blanche qui lit dans la ponche, c'est la plume, le portrait. It will be exactly as here, and in this life, and the table. The Bible, Goethe, the ink, with the same temporal odour, paper, pale, woman, white, thought reader. Ce sera tout à fait comme dans cette vie. Le même jardin, profond, profond, tout fut obscur, et vers midi, des gens se réjouiront d'être réunis là, qui ne se sont jamais connus et qui ne savent les uns des autres que ceci, qu'il faudra s'habiller comme pour une fête et aller dans la nuit des disparus, tout seul, sans amour et sans nom. Ce sera tout à fait comme dans cette vie, la même allée. And that one must put on one's best clothes to go into the night at the end of things, loveless and lampless. It will be the same as in this life, the same lane in the forest, and at midday in mid-autumn, when the clean road turns like a weeping woman, to gather the valley flowers, we will cross in our walks, as in the yesterday you have forgotten, in the gown whose colour you have forgotten. There is a huge difference between what de MILOSZ wrote and how it was translated by Pound. The French text is at least double, and Pound used his sense and his sensibility to translate the very best and made a marvellous poem, as Pound always did. I think the point I want to make here is that translation has to be imitation. The best translators are the best poets, and Pound is constantly being in trouble and attacked for the quality of his translation. In 1919, a critic called William Hale made a huge attack on some of Pound's Latin translations, saying that Pound didn't know Latin. I think this would be very unlikely, as Pound actually was a lecturer in classics in an American college. But Pound was translating as a poet, looking for the poem. And the problem with de MILOSZ is he tends, sadly, to rather go on a bit. And Pound took the essence of that poem and turned it into a very good poem indeed. That is one way to translate. And the other way, which I think is equally good, is to simply print a prose translation, which is what happened in the classic Penguin translations, 4 volumes of French verse, and the translations Francis Scarpade of Rimbaud and Verlaine in the 60s, which still today are the best translations available. And then one can see word for word what the French actually means and have a different kind of way in, a different conduit into the poem. And I'll read you a little bit of MILOSZ's book, long poem, La Charrette, the cart. L'esprit purifié par les nombres du temple. La pensée réassaisie à peine par la chair déjà. Déjà, ce vieux bruit sourd, hivernal de la vie, du cœur froid de la terre monte vers le mien. My soul purified by the numbers of the temple, my thoughts hardly recovered by my flesh, already, this old, dull, wintry noise of life rises from the cold heart of the earth, rises towards mine. C'est le premier tombereau du matin, le premier tombereau du matin. Il tourne le coin de la rue, et dans ma conscience, la toux du vieux boueur, fils de l'aube, dégenouillé, m'ouvre comme une clé la porte de mon jour. It is the first morning tumbril, the first morning tumbril. It turns the corner of the street, and in my consciousness the coughing of the old dustman, son of the ragged dawn, opens my day's gate for me like a key. I have tried recently to make a translation of one of the many, many poems of Jacques Reyder, which has not been translated into English. And I got somebody who was bilingual to do a baseline prose translation. And I've been working sporadically on this poem for about a month. And I'm talking of one poem, quite a long poem, about 60 lines long. And the problem is that the greatness of the poem, which is not true of all Reyder's work, but this particular poem, is in its rhythmic structure. And when you translate it literally, it doesn't actually make that much sense. And I realised very quickly that if I'm going to make a publishable translation, I'm going to have to leave out certain parts, add things, and do as Pound did to make an imitation, and Lowell did this as well in his translations of Baudelaire. I'm very, very tired of people who know languages but do not know literature, and presuming as they have a linguistic knowledge, they can't write. There are a number of people. I remember in the 60s, I knew a translator called Michael Bullock. He was a very good translator, but he was a dire poet, and he thought he was a great poet. And he's dead now, so I can say this. And there are certain translators who I cannot mention, but all these translators, and I will not say who they translate, because again it would say who they are, but there are several of these people working for major publishing houses, and they all believe they can write poetry. And believe me, they can't. They know nothing about how to write poetry. They're almost the worst poetasters in print. The translations are okay, but their own poems are not. And I think this is why one has to hope at some point that poets will turn to these poets and translate them. It is amazing how blown up reputations, this is very true in French poetry, particularly the French poet Yves Bonnefoy, who I find empty and hollow. But he is a professor at the Collège de France, and he's translated, I think, half a dozen plays of Shakespeare into French, and he's basically an academic, and all his poetry is translated into English, not once, but I believe twice. He didn't, admittedly, write a great deal. But I think it's a great tragedy that poets like de MILOSZ and other poets who were very connected to Cubism around its birth, were friends of Gris and Picasso, these poets are largely forgotten. Very, very tragic indeed. I think it was MILOSZ who was actually having a meal with Picasso when he had a stroke and died 2 years later. These were poets very central to Cubism, very central to modernism, but are known very little outside French and the Francophone world.